Welcome to Chats from the Wine Cellar, the official inventory podcast. I'm Yula Georgieva, and this week I'm very excited to have our first winemaker in the hot seat, my friend Matt Day at the famed Klein Constantia estate in South Africa. Now, Matt, I usually tell people's bios for them, but you have such a good story about how you got into wine and then got to Klein Constantia, so I'm just going to hand it right over to you and you tell us the story.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a fantastic privilege to be on the show, especially all the way out there in Canada. I mean, I feel like we're in Canadian weather at the moment. It's been freezing here and raining and miserable. Lots of rubber there. Anyway, in terms of my bio, it's very simple. I've kind of grown up at Klein Constantia. I've been here for the last 15 years. I started in 2008 at Klein Constantia. Before that, I studied at the University of Stellenbosch. And, I'm actually from Johannesburg. So moving from Johannesburg to Stellenbosch to study winemaking is a pretty stupid idea because, there's no vineyards out in Johannesburg. And it's basically the Wild West out there. But I grew up on a farm. I could drive a tractor before I could ride a bike. And I had this passion for farming. So I decided to move to Stellenbosch, study winemaking. Long story short, I then landed up with my first internship at a wine farm called Meteoric in Stellenbosch. And in that time, I decided to make a barrel of wine, a barrel of Shiraz, purely because I thought I could drink it with my mates at university and have a good time and have some cheap wine, Going into that, I made the Shiraz, bought the barrel, bought some grapes, did my thing. It turned out fantastically, by the way, my first ever attempt.
Nice.
And it took a lot longer than what I was expecting. So then I worked in Australia in the Barossa Valley, came back to South Africa. And at the time I was back in South Africa, I bottled the Shiraz at Meteoric. And I was granted a very privileged interview at Klein Constantia with the then winemaker Adam Mason for just an internship position. And I just bottled the Shiraz and I decided, well, let me be a bit gutsy. I had a magnum of the Shiraz that I just bottled in my car. So I stormed into the interview and I slapped the bottle on this table actually that I'm sitting at now, a bottle of Shiraz onto the table. I said, Adam, hey, if you like this wine, you have to give me the job. If you don't like the wine, we'll carry on with the interview. And for some reason, we carried on with the interview and he didn't taste the wine, but he liked me and he gave me the job as an intern at Klein Constantia. I then worked for a couple of months and then I went to Saint-Emilion after that. Am I wrong? No, I worked in Saint-Emilion before starting Klein Constantia after that interview. And then started off with Klein Constantia, and the rest is kind of history. I went from intern to assistant winemaker within a year. And then a year later, a couple of years later, Klein Constantia was actually put on the market and sold. And Adam, being the winemaker, then decided to move to greener pastures in Stellenbosch. And for some other odd reason, the owners of Klein Constantia, or the new owners of Klein Constantia, kind of looked at me and they said, well, Matt, you've been here for a really long time. You understand the place, the terroir and all the rest. We'll give you one opportunity, one chance to prove yourself. And if you do well, you can have the job as head winemaker at Klein Constantia. I don't think they realized I'd been at Klein Constantia for such a short amount of time. I was also only 20, I think I was 27 years old then. So I was quite fortunate that they put all their trust in me. And together with that, I was also quite fortunate that two owners of Klein Constantia are French legends. So we've got Bruno Prats, who used to own Stel, and Hubert de Bouard and Chateau Angelus. So being a young winemaker, being very naive in terms of the way that I did things, I had the backing of two legends to kind of, help with think tanks. We actually rebuilt the cellar and they helped me with a lot of the development, design and all the rest. And every year they kind of came out and it was kind of like an exam paper. They would go through and taste every single wine and crit me on it. And it got a lot less daunting as we went along, but it was good fun. I never failed. I never got fired. I'm still here today and still telling the story, which is pretty cool. In my time at Klein, I've worked in Hungary. I worked in Apple Valley. I've worked quite a lot in Sancerre, a couple of vintages out there, and Little Under Pomerol for Weber's property as well. So long story short, I also now have taken over the responsibilities of making wine in Stellenbosch at Wilke, which is our red wine estate. And for some reason, I'm still here. I love this place. I mean, it's kind of like the retirement job for anyone. And I guess the issue that I had was I started here young, and I've reached a position that most people aspire to getting to at a very young age. So it's only onwards and upwards from here on out.
Well, it is a very special place. It's probably the most beautiful estate in, I'm gonna say in the Cape, just because I have a very soft spot for it. But that's a great story about them coming and tasting with you. How intimidating.
Yeah, sure.
Bordeaux legends critiquing your work, but obviously, as you said, you've done great. So let's turn to the estate itself. Now, Klein Constantia is a very special estate within South Africa. Tell us a little bit about the history of what it meant back with South Africa's initiation into wine back in the 17th century, but then also about this revival in the 20th century that brought it back onto the map.
Okay, well, I'll try not to tell you too much because the story is very long. The bragging point that we have is Constantia Valley, or the Constantia Wine Farm, is the oldest New World producing vineyard in the world. So to put that into perspective, it was founded in 1685 by Simon van Stel. And that is way before Australia, way before Napoleon, or wherever else. The only other wine was made for church, for communion, and that would have been in some of the colonies. But anyway, so Simon van Stel, and going back to a story about the beauty of it, he surveyed the soil and the land throughout the Cape in those days. He was the governor. He was granted any land that he pleased to start his estate or his farm. And that's exactly what it was. It was an experimental farm to see what they could do and how they could push the boundaries and what they could grow. And as a result of these soil samples that they took, that they actually sent back to Holland to have analyzed or checked, he decided to plant his flag here in Constantia. And my story is, it's purely because of the beauty. And if you do come here, it's on the Cape Peninsula. We're right between the ocean on both sides. We're overlooking Table Mountain and Stellenbosch and all the rest. It is a beautiful spot. And just imagine having a property right here. The other benefits is we had the trade route coming through. So the harbor or the port in those days was in Simonstown, and they would have traveled through Constantia to get to the colony, or to the Cape of Good Hope, or the Cape Castle. So we had all the wagons coming through, and it became a very easy point to pick up wine, to pick up produce. I guess we're a greengrocer there. So he started the vineyards. He didn't make it famous. He was the pioneer. He then moved on to find a little wine growing area called Stellenbosch. I don't know if anyone's heard of that. It's somewhere they make a little bit of red wine and stuff. So he went on to find Stellenbosch under Stel. After left, and their son was involved and all the rest. It was a guy called Hendrik Kluti, who got a lot of the credit for making the Sweet Wine of Constantia. We've done quite a bit of research today into the history, and we've actually just written a book on Under Constance, or the Sweet Wines of Constantia. And we found there was actually a guy called Johannes Verlaine that was very, very influential in the old Sweet Wine of Constantia. And often I talk about the success of the Sweet Wine of Constantia, and I say that was purely because it was the sugar that formed preservative in the wine that meant it could last the voyage all the way back to Europe without oxidizing, going off and all the rest. And then you could picture this wine from deepest, darkest Africa that the kings and queens and aristocracy were sharing. And that was my old story. It was because of the sugar that it could be preserved and last that voyage. And it kind of wasn't. Looking into the history, Johannes Verlaine had these incredible ideas of burning sulfur in the barrels, and it was X amount of sulfur to preserve it. And he spoke about pest control in the vineyards, and topping barrels, and a whole lot of things that we still do today at Klein Constantia. One of them was fantastic. He said, in order to stop weevils from climbing into this is a long story, sorry, but it's quite cool. I mean, in order to stop the weevils from getting into the bunch zone, he took leaves and he tied string around it, around the stem with the leaves. And because the weevils, they couldn't get through the leaves, they couldn't climb up the trunk, and they couldn't get into the bunch zone and attack the bunches and the berries and stuff like that, which was fantastic. We do a very similar thing today. It's a very organic way of doing it. We tie cotton wool to the trunks, and their feet get stuck in the cotton wool and they can't get into the leaf zone. So instead of spraying everything, he had a really cool organic way of doing it. So that's how smart he was. And he was the guy that started making the Sweet Wine of Constantia properly. And he would have made the old famous vintages of the 1791s. And I've been fortunate enough to taste that vintage. It's absolutely insane. It's an incredible wine. A more recent one was just sold on auction for £60,000, and that was the 1821. I've also tasted that, and it's still alive. You know, that preservative or that, you know, the sugar and the sulfur, whatever they did in those days meant that this wine could last forever, which is fantastic. Let's fast forward. So he made it famous. The farmers then divided when Hendrik Klute had it. He left the farm to his two sons. So the eldest son got Groot Constantia, which is our neighbor, and the youngest son got Klein Constantia, Groot meaning large and Klein meaning small. So that's when the farms were divided. That was in about 1820s, 1822, I think. I'm making this up, by the way. It's somewhere around there.
It sounds very official.
Yeah, I know. If you make it up with confidence, it's really good. But it's pretty much in that time zone. So that's when it was divided. And one thing that I must stress is the old Wine of Constantia was called the Sweet Wine of Constantia. It was never called Vin de Constance or anything like that. We've recreated the wine today and being the Vin de Constance as a tribute to that old wine. So we'll carry on with the story at about 1885. I've had a bottle of 1875. It's also just as good. It's more fresh, more perfume, more aromatic than those older vintages. It's still drinking very well. 1885, a couple of things happened. Oidium, so mildew hit the Cape and destroyed a lot of the vineyards. Phylloxera, that we always talk about, destroyed a lot of the vineyards as well. The English started a free trade agreement with the French, so they started to import wine from the French instead of their colonies. So we struggled with selling wine then and with export and trade. So a lot of the wine industry within the Cape kind of came to a standstill. And then it slowly, then it went into the era of the corporations, so the bigger producers that were buying a lot of grapes and all the rest. So we stopped producing wine in 1885. We only recreated the Vin de Constance in 1986. So the new owners bought the property in 1980, planted the vineyards, recreated the Sweet Wine of Constantia, and planted the Sauvignon Blanc that we're now famous for, and did a fantastic job in reviving this insane product and brand. Yeah, cool. Long story, but it's a great.
It's such a good history. I love your point about it being the oldest New World estate, right? Because I think many people do think of South Africa as an old world, as a New World country within the world of wine, but really it's not. I mean, I think the Medoc didn't start producing wine until after Simon van der Stel started, right?
Yeah, it's crazy, yeah.
So we spoke a little bit about the Vin de Constance. For all of our collectors who may not know what that is, let's actually dive into that one, because that is a very special wine. So tell us a little bit about the Vin de Constance and what makes it so special and distinct among the sweet wines of the world.
Sure. So let me grab a bottle so everyone can see it. I've got a couple of halves. Let's do 2012 because that's actually
those are for display, not to wet the whistle between work.
No, that's for display. It is 4 o'clock, so it's almost 1 o'clock. And that's the 2012 Vin de Constance, which is my first vintage of BDC. In terms of Vin de Constance, it is a unique sweet wine. It's not a sweet wine that's made from botrytis. It's made from raisins, and it's made in the old style that they would have done for those first couple of vintages of the Sweet Wine of Constantia. It's made from Muscat Frontignan, or Muscat Le Petit Grand, or Muscat Blanc. And in the old days, they used to use Semillon, Pontac, and Chenin Blanc as well. We've tried, we've experimented, we've looked at it. None of those cultivars work for the style of wine that we're trying to make. The reason for its success is because Muscat has got very thick skin and it's able to raise an output point that we need for sugar. Let's move on in terms of vineyards. We plant this on the warmest slopes of Klein Constantia. I say warmest slopes, the property is in a very cold area where we've got the ocean on both sides. So hence we can get a lot of sunlight, which helps with raising, but we've also got the cool conditions to help with a very long ripening season. In terms of harvesting, we harvest over 2 months. So we start with the very early stuff that's got high acidity to the very late stuff, which is predominantly just raisins. It gets to the point that the guys go and pick individual raisins, and that forms the heart and soul of Vin de Constance. And I mentioned it earlier, it's not a botrytis wine, it's not a noble land harvest. We don't want that. We don't want to make the same style as the other great sweet wines of the world. Our point of difference is that we are different. So we pick all those batches. It gets to the point that the guys are so specialized in the vineyards that we say, right, guys, today we want 30% raisins on the bunch, and that's what they'll go out and pick, or 40% or 80%, and that's what they pick. We bring it into the cellar, and the cellar, the winemaking is quite interesting in that we kind of make it like a red wine. So we don't try and protect it from oxidation and press it straight away or anything like that. We want to extract as much sugar and flavor out of the skins as possible. So we do 1 week cold with non-Saccharomyces yeast on it, just to protect it on the skins. And then we warm it up and we ferment it on the skins for another week. We'll then press it. And generally over harvest for those 2 months, we've got roughly about 30 different batches that we'll harvest. Wow. So every single batch is then pressed separately. It goes into its own tank. And then I get to a point that we're very focused on at the moment. Sweet wines are not popular anymore. Sweet wines are very often unliked, and that's purely because they're too sweet, they're too overpowering, and too cloy. They're not, it's just too much at the end of the meal. So we're looking for that balance factor, that X factor that means that the wine is almost sweet but tastes dry, if that makes sense. So in order to achieve that, we start blending those 30 different batches during the fermentation process, with the goal of blending the very early high acid stuff with the very late sweet stuff. And we're trying to get to that rule of thumb ratio of 14% alcohol to 165 grams per liter of sugar. In terms of sugar like that, to put in perspective, the can of Coke is about 180 grams per liter of sugar. So that's kind of the level of sugar that the Wine of Constantia is. I'm not trying to equate Wine of Constantia to Coke, but anyway. So if you get it into that ratio, that's kind of like the happy medium, that it forms an environment that your yeast can't survive in anymore. So it becomes very stable. You don't have any re-fermentation. You don't have any issues later down in the line of the aging of the wine. So you don't have to stop it with temperature. You don't have to add salt. You don't have to filter it. So we blend all those components, and those 30 different batches get compressed into about 6 different batches that have that perfect ratio between sugar, alcohol, and acidity. And that's as good as you can get it for a sweet wine. We then put it into barrel for 1.5 years. The point of that barrel age is we have about 50 to 60% new oak barrels, so 500-liter barrels. At that point, you get a lot of oxygen uptake and you get a lot of oak uptake. So that's where it evolves from a very primary Turkish delight, aromatic, pretty kind of wine, and it evolves into something that is more expressive, a lot more powerful. So I call those secondary characteristics. And that's when you start to get the apricot and citrus and blossoms and all those. So it evolves in that 1.5 years to that complexity point. And then we want to put it into a time capsule and protect it. So we take it out of barrels and we put it into very large format oak foudre. So they're 4,500 liter tanks that have very thick staves. So there's no micro-oxygenation happens, no air intake into the wine. And that then preserves it from going from secondary to tertiary, keeps it in that secondary characteristic kind of flavor, but you're still getting oak integration. So you're still getting evolution of the wine without aging the wine. We then take it out. We'll blend for about 6 months with a specialist blending panel. So there's a lot of work. What I'm trying to say is there's a lot of work that goes into every single bottle of Wine of Constantia. It's not just a sweet wine. It is unique, and it does have that point of difference. And I think that's what's made Wine of Constantia very special in the last couple of years. It's light and delicate enough to have at any point of the meal. It's not just a sweet wine at the beginning of the meal.
Yeah, from my own perspective, I adore it. And I collect it. I've actually served it next to Chateau d'Yquem at tastings, and it is always a hit, right? It is a different style because Chateau d'Yquem obviously has that botrytis characteristic, but it is a wonderful wine that does hold its own next to even that top.
Yeah.
So how does it age, Vin de Constance? Because you mentioned a few of the older ones that you've had, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how your style, a bit of a fresher style, compares to some of those older styles from the 18th, 19th centuries, like the originals. But then how does your current style age and evolve in the cellar? What can collectors expect in 20 years from now?
Sure. So, sorry, that was just load shedding. The electricity's just gone off. It came back on again, and it's generated. Welcome to South Africa. Luckily, the internet didn't get up. In terms of ageability of Vin Constance, I have two preferences, right? I like to drink it within the first year of bottling. If you're looking for that big, wow, aromatic, explosive flavor characteristic, that's fantastic. The other, then on the other side, excuse me, is it ages incredibly. I mean, it can last forever. It can last. It's going to outlast us regardless. I've actually got one wine in a cellar, which is 2003. It's been 20 years in barrel, and it is fantastic right now. I'm aiming to leave it for 50 years in the barrel, just to see what happens. So in terms of aging, it's that's what I wanted to get into. It is probably the only investment wine in South Africa. So aged, it does get better. It's very scarce. I've been putting away a couple of cases every year. When I first started buying Vin Constantia, it was worth next to nothing, and now it's worth 10 times more. So it is a perfect wine to put away for the like kind of your kid's university fund or whatever it is. The value will appreciate, provided that I do my job correctly at Klein Constantia. It will age very well, and it will appreciate in value.
We'll check in with you every 10 years and hold you to account if our university funds are not turning out. But so optimally, you would drink it within the first year if you wanted that fresher, pungent, aromatic experience. And then what's the next sort of milestone?
So first year, and then after about 7 years. And then after that, if you want to go for that very aged character, then I've really started to enjoy the 1991, 1992 Vin Constance. I think those are getting into that really nice tertiary kind of characteristic, which is fantastic. What I've done a couple of times is you do a 5-course meal, and you do Vin Constance for the pairings. So you can do all different vintages to pair throughout the meal. So the very young one I'll do at the end with cheese. The very old one I'll do with the main course. So one of the best combinations I had was a fillet steak with Vin Constance, very old Vin Constance. And then you can do that like 7-year-old Vin Constance with a kind of duck liver parfait or something like that, which, is a match made in heaven.
Oh, that sounds great. Now I'm getting hungry. And it's only 10:08. I'm ready for some foie gras. Well, are there any particular vintages, either under your watch or prior, that you'd call out as very memorable?
There's a couple. So the 2004 is a fantastic vintage. That was the first vintage by Adam Mason. It's one of my favorite. 2012 is my first vintage. So I have to love it. It's my first child. 2018 and 2019 are fantastic vintages to look out for. That's kind of the sum of all the effort that we've done at Klein Constantia in the last couple of years coming together. And then if you go into the older vintages, if you can get your hands on any 1995 or 1996 vintages, they are fantastic. They have aged. They're still very fresh. On 1996, I get, do you guys have prickly pear? Oh, no.
I know what it is, but we don't. It's not prevalent.
Yeah, it's okay. So it's a very traditional South African, it's kind of like a fruit from a cactus. You can call it that. Very characteristic of that. And the 1995 has a chocolate chili kind of character to it, which is quite unique. Never seen that in wine before, but it's out there.
So that's why that one would have gone with the steak.
Yeah, for sure. Then going into vintages like 1986 and 1987, they are very sought after. I mean, they'll probably be the most expensive wines you can buy in South Africa at the moment. We only produced a couple of barrels, so if you can get your hands on any of those, then they're worth a lot of money. Well,
Vin Constantia is probably, I'd say, your flagship wine, but it's not your only wine. So let's talk a little bit about the other wines that you make, because you're also known for Sauvignon Blanc, as you mentioned.
Yeah, so my favorite wines actually is Sauvignon Blanc. I love to make Sauvignon Blanc. I'm crazy Sauvignon Blanc nut. And that's kind of because I've grown up with the property, and Klein Constantia terroir is perfectly defined for Sauvignon Blanc. So on all the higher slopes at Klein Constantia, we've got planted to Sauvignon Blanc. Again, I spoke about the temperature. It's a lot cooler here because of the ocean. It forms our air conditioning. We also have east-facing and south-facing vineyards, which are prime location in the southern hemisphere for growing very good white cultivars. They're a lot cooler because of this morning sunlight, and south-facing is obviously away from the sun and all the rest. So those factors kind of play into our hand perfectly, and that the terroir here is fantastic for Savvy. very good pHs, very good acidity, creation, still rest. All of that put together, I mean, we make, I think 55% of our production is planted to Sauvignon Blanc. It is our number one selling wine throughout the world. You can get it anywhere and everywhere. And the goal that I have, or we have at Klein Constantia, is New Zealand is fantastic. It's a very, new world approach. It's very defined and distinct in characteristics. But it's not for everyone. I mean, I'm very happy to drink a very easy tutti frutti Sauvignon Blanc, and I'm not slaying New Zealand here, but quite often Sauvignon Blanc has just become a cash cow. So you plant it in the wrong spot and you kind of just bring it into the cellar, get it out of the cellar within a couple of months, and you sell it for a lot of money, and it's a very quick turnover of money. So people have jumped onto the bandwagon. I mean, it's part of the big five. So Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, Cabernet, Merlot, and Pinot, or whatever, or Shiraz, I guess it's one of those. People know the name, they know what they get, and they'll buy it. So we've kind of lost the track, I think, with Sauvignon Blanc in the last couple of years, and that people aren't taking it seriously enough. It's not regarded as one of the pure and noble cultivars anymore. And that's what our goal is to restore Sauvignon Blanc to the level that Sancerre is. I mean, if you think of Sancerre, you don't really associate it with Sauvignon Blanc anymore. You just think of it as being fantastic, big, proper white wine. So that's the goal with our Sauvignon Blanc. We actually make, I think at one point we were making 10 different Sauvignon Blancs at Klein Constantia, with the sole purpose of experimenting, researching, playing around, going back to the basics and figuring out how to understand our land better and to make a proper wine from that. So those 10, I think we're doing 6 at the moment. Only one of them is commercially available all over the world. The rest are kind of geeky, sommelier, wine club member wines that you can only really get if you get from the estate or a couple of fancy restaurants or wine shops. In terms of the style, I mentioned back to the basics. So when I first started off making Sauvignon Blanc, I used to make Sauvignon Blanc like I was taught in university. And that's purely add lots of sulfur, protect it, follow all the tricks in the textbook, and make it in that very aromatic, tutti frutti style. That's not really the problem with that is everyone's doing that, and your wine starts to taste like your neighbor's wine. So we're trying to make something a little bit more unique. And here's where working in Sancerre has helped quite a lot, in that we have thought out of the box and we've gone back to the way that we think it should be made. So we purposely oxidize the juice crush. We don't protect the flavors. And by doing that, you're able to focus on very stable flavors instead of the ones that break down anyway after 6 months after bottling. So you can make a more stable, robust Sauvignon Blanc by oxidizing them for everyone before they oxidize in the bottle. So we oxidize before fermentation. Fermentation then brings it back into revitalized phase, so it's more sour. It's also almost 100% wild fermentation at the moment on our Blancs. And then we play around with a whole lot of other cool things. So we don't add anything except for sulfur, bentonite, and nutrients. But then the other way that we can get complexity and play around with the style or learn what our terroir is fermentation temperature, turbidity, so the soluble content of the wine, and a little bit of oak. So we do a little bit of oak into our Savvy as well. All that said is you have to go out and try Klein Constantia Sauvignon Blanc if you can find it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, since it is different, and because, as you mentioned, you oxidize it, are these wines that can age?
Yeah, so traditionally our wines, regardless, do age well, and that's purely because of the pH balance. So the 1986 Klein Constantia Sauvignon Blanc is still regarded as the greatest Sauvignon Blanc ever made in South Africa, and which is fantastic to know that. And that we were drinking up until a couple of years ago. You had about half an hour after pulling the cork. The wine was fantastic, and they would kind of oxidize and fall to pieces. So the worst thing that you can do with Sauvignon Blanc is drink it within the first 6 months of bottling. The problem is at the moment they want to drink 2024 Sauvignon Blanc already because that's what they've been taught. Ideally for us, after about 3 years, the wine only starts to show up Sauvignon Blanc characteristics. It starts to lose that fermentation aromatics and starts to focus on what the pure aromatics are of that piece of terroir. So it should age. It should have some time. I discovered the 1995 Sauvignon Blanc about a year ago, and it is a fantastic wine. It's still beautiful, super aromatic, it had lasted that test of time. The problem is it didn't last very long because I drank every single bottle in the cellar. So that's how good it was, and that's how well it had.
Have you noticed anything through your learnings with trying these different plots? Have you noticed anything in particular about the different terroirs? Are there some that are quite unique? Are there some that you would maybe equate to a Sancerre or a Puy Fumé, or what have you learned in that experimentation?
The most important thing that I've learned is don't overcomplicate things and don't overthink them. As soon as you start doing that, you make a generic style of wine. So let the wines do the talking. But no, the main thing that I've learned is in South Africa, and I think in a lot of the New World, we don't talk about our soil or our geology well enough or often enough. So it is vitally important to start talking about soil a lot more. The issue that a lot of people have is they don't have one single property or one single vineyard. They buy grapes from all over the wine growing regions. So they don't have that identity of soil. So they don't have the ability to talk about it like that. So in terms of what we have at Klein Constantia, and this is what stood out since we went more back to the basics and approach, is we have Table Mountain sandstone on Klein Constantia, and we've got decomposed granites. And if I can equate it to the way that we used to do in Sancerre, it's all about mouthfeel, feel, and texture and all the rest. So Sancerre, you've got Select, Flint, which has that flinty spicy character. You've got Chalk, which has that richness and roundness on the palate. So for us, granite is pure salinity. It's salty, it's savory, it's umami on our Sauvignon Blancs. For me, it's kind of like a dirty flint. So it is not as polished and refined, but it still gives you that rough rawness to the wine, which is fantastic. So if you pick up any Klein Constantia Savies, you'll always get this lovely bitterness. It's almost like your gin and tonic kind of bitterness, which is really refreshing, which I absolutely love. And then the sandstone, we've got very small pockets of sandstone on the higher line vineyards of Klein Constantia. And sandstone for me is just that round the side kind of palate that almost like a donut. So it fills your mouth, but doesn't have the texture in the middle. You put the two together and you can have that full effect of granite and sandstone put together on a Savvy. So we do have site-specific wines that are made on either of those. So those go into our single vineyard series. But the Klein Constantia Estate Sauvignon Blanc is made from 42 different vineyard blocks. And ideally there you've got south facing, you've got east facing, low altitude, you've got high altitude, and sandstone and granite. And then you're kind of painting a picture with one color and expressing a hell of a lot of different definition and context and all the rest to that one wine, which is fantastic.
How many plots do you have now? Because you've mapped the estate quite a lot of detail.
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, I think we have about 65 to 67 different plots. We are only 65 hectares. So that means there's a lot of very small blocks, and each one so this formed part of our new Klein Constantia regime. Is the first thing that we did is we replanted all the vineyards to what made sense and to make quality wine. So in the old days, it was more about making more wine. Now we're trying to make better wine. That's the only way to survive today's market. So we replanted everything. We made the blocks a lot smaller, and we planted them in the right spot for what worked. So there's a hell of a lot of different blocks to play around with. And the lovely thing is, I now understand the personality of every single block. So you know how to treat it in the cellar to harness the potential of what that block actually is. And you put that all together and you can create something that is a representation of this beautiful sense of place.
Well, what other varietals are you also growing right now? Because maybe the Vin de Constance is your flagship. The Sauvignon Blancs are obviously also very definitive of Klein Constantia, but you have a range of other wines. So what are the others?
Yeah, so we have a couple of niche wines. So we're doing a little bit of Riesling. So we're one of the last, I think, 9 producers in South Africa.
Which I love. I love your Riesling.
As well. But needs some age. I mean, I've actually got a Riesling tasting tomorrow. We're going to taste Riesling from 1987 until current vintage. So pretty fun. So we do Riesling. We're doing Chardonnay for both bubbles and for still wine Chardonnay. But we do tiny little volumes of that. That's more just to enjoy the estate and sell through the wine club. We do a little bit of red at Klein Constantia. So we make one red wine called the Estate Red, which is made up of Cabernet, Malbec, Petit, and Shiraz. And what am I missing? I think that's about it. We've got a lot of experimental blocks. So the experimental blocks are to try and see how we can improve the Wine of Constance. We've planted Harsh Levallois. We've just planted Petit Marseille. We're planting Ferment soon. We planted Chenin. All this with the idea of improving Wine of Constance. And I feel like I've missed a couple of other cultures. I think I make way too many wines. We make a rosé, we make this and that's the next thing. The focus on Klein Constantia is white wine and Wine of Constance. So in terms of making a big, bold red wine that can compete with other red wines in the rest of the world, we have our Stellenbosch properly filled in Wilke, and that is a properly focused cellar and vineyard for making the highest level reds that you can possibly make. So there we've got Cabernet and Syrah, and that's where Hubert de Bouard and Bruno Prats come into play quite heavily, because we use their expertise in terms of blending and concepts and barrels and equipment and all the rest to make a very smart red wine. I'm going to London next month to present a tasting with Hubert de Bouard, where we will be having some of his wines next to and Wilke for this tasting, and a little bit of Wine of Constance, I guess, which is pretty cool. I can present with the legend himself.
Well, you're becoming a bit of a legend yourself too, so I wouldn't discount what you're going to bring to that table. That sounds like a really fun tasting.
It's really good fun tasting, yeah.
Well, let's just talk a little bit about how Constantia wines and Klein Constantia wines fit into the world of collecting. When you travel around, because I know you do travel quite a bit to bring these wines to different markets, do you find that at this stage people are quite familiar with what you do and what Constantia represents? I mean, maybe it's probably not, I would assume, at the same level of Bordeaux or Burgundy in that sense, but given that the history is not there. But do you find that there's more of a recognition of the quality that you're able to produce?
Yeah, so what we find is everyone knows Wine of Constance. So Wine of Constance, no matter where you are in the world, people know the brand and the wine. Very few people realize that Wine of Constance is made by Klein Constantia. So it's quite tough. We have certain markets that we're doing really well in. So if we go to the UK, we're selling everywhere, and we're doing a great job there. I actually did a trip to New Zealand a couple of years ago to try and sell Sauvignon Blanc to the Kiwis. It was more of a fact-finding mission to figure out what's going on in New Zealand and taste wines and all the rest. But in order to do that, we had to have it as a marketing trip. So we had to go and try sell wines. And I'll never forget, we did a couple of benchmark tastings with their who's who of wine writers and, wine geeks and all the rest. And I got up and I said, "Hi, I'm Matt Dow from Klein Constantia. Today we've got 10 different Sauvignon Blancs in front of you." And they were all like, "Oh, not happy about it." And they tasted it, and they all absolutely loved the style of Sauvignon Blanc and what Klein Constantia actually represented. So we are unknown across a lot of the world in terms of Klein Constantia, but if we do our job well and we get the reputation of Wine of Constance to the point that it should be, it will pull the Klein Constantia brand with us. We also don't make enough wine to sell all over the world, so we have to pick our markets nicely, and we can't visit everywhere. We like to have that nice personal touch when it comes to all of our wines. So we like to actually visit the markets and spend some time on it in order to sell wines, and rather than just randomly sending containers over to places and hoping for the best.
Are there any producers or winemakers or even regions that you really look to as benchmarks that help you evolve your style? Or because I know you're probably used by others, especially for your for the sweet wine, but in either the sweet wines or the Sauvignon Blancs, are there any benchmarks that you would point to?
So in terms of Sauvignon Blanc at Sancerre, that's why I head out there quite often. So I mean, we work very closely with Pascal Jolivet, and that has helped a lot. And I'm crazy about producers like Didier Dagenot or François Cotta or whoever it is out there. So that's really nice to see. And it's also nice to get out of the South African palate, because, South African palates, you only taste South African wines. You think South African wines are fantastic. We don't get exposed to the rest of the wines all over the world. So Sancerre is very important. Who else? I guess Chateau Angelus, we have a very close relationship. So it's quite nice that, when I was very young, I went out to go visit Sandrine in the Cam. I mean, she's not there anymore, but she spent a lot of time with me. She explained a lot of things to me. She helped me out a lot in terms of my journey. She didn't have any secrets. She basically asked me, said, Matt, what are you struggling with? How can I help you? And she was always there. She was a phone call away to offer assistance. The nice thing was I went out there and I learned from her. And then a couple of years later, she sent her assistant winemaker out to come and learn from us at Klein Constantia. So we've got that nice relationship. I've worked in Turkey and Hungary, and there we had quite good relationships as well. Which we learn a lot from them, and likewise them from us. Bordeaux is quite influential, and that's purely because of our Bordeaux relationship. I think that's about it. There's so many good wines in the world.
There are
so many great benchmarks and wines to aspire to and look up to. So especially with Wilka, I mean, there's so many great brands that we are looking at and benchmarking with to see how we can get to a point that we're established like them, we have equal quality to them. Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Anwilka. So in terms of style, is it more steering towards Bordeaux, which would make sense given the proprietors, or are you, given the climate, looking for more of a California richer style, or is it somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, I think it's somewhere in the middle. So what happened was they came up with the idea of making a Bordeaux wine in South Africa, and they realized very quickly that we're a lot hotter than Bordeaux is. The conditions are completely different. The soils are different. And the other thing they realized is Merlot just does not work in South Africa. There's certain spots that works at, but the Merlot in South Africa, I think our growing season's too short and we're too hot. So it never gets that phenological flavor that you kind of need in order for Merlot to be elegant and refined and all this. So Merlot is quite aggressive. It's very leafy. It's very green, if not done well. So they planted Merlot and they pulled it out within a couple of years because they didn't like it enough. But the main component of Wilka is Cabernet. And Cabernet for us, and Cabernet and Stellenbosch is actually king. I thought going in there, the Shiraz is going to be much better, and the Shiraz will give us more juicy, more elegant, more refined flavors. And I think that was my Barossa Valley hat on, saying that, you can make a big Shiraz, big jammy Shiraz and everything. After starting to work there, I tried blends and various blends and ideas and concepts and all the rest of the Shiraz, and I wanted to make a Shiraz-based blend. And in every single blind tasting that we did for blends, the blend with the majority of Cabernet always stood out as being the best blend. And that's purely because it's just got the backbone that holds it together. Means that the wine's going to last for a lot longer and be a bit more ageable than a Shiraz-based blend. But what we've done is we went from being looking for a very Bordeaux style, then we went, I think, for quite a Napa-driven style, that it was very ripe, very extracted, very bold, very powerful, looking for the big scores from all the wine critics. And then my mandate when I started in Wilka is we've made fantastic wines in the old days that have done very well, but how can we find a more elegant kind of style of red wine, and how can we produce that at Wilka? And I think today's wine drinkers are steering towards something that's a little bit lighter, a little bit more elegant, a little bit more perfumed. So we changed the style. I mean, fortunately, that was during kind of COVID times, so no one could come in and interfere with us. We just did whatever the hell we wanted to do at Wilka. And then afterwards, I had to present it, and everyone kind of loved the style. So we picked nice and early, and we also took the Syrah, and we harvested it a lot earlier. So we harvested it earlier, and we did a whole bunch of fermentation on it and blended the two together, as well as in perfecting the barrel aging and the type of barrels that we used. It's a lot more elegant, it's a lot more refined and austere and everything.
Question for you about scores. This might be a tricky question, but I know you're very connected to being terroir driven and how you produce wines and letting the wines express where they're from. But do you find that you have to think about that, the scores that you might be able to obtain, and give credence to different critics' palates, or do you just let the wine do what it needs to do and say, like it or leave it?
Scores are always helpful, provided that the right scores. There's a lot of scores these days that mean nothing. We've done some research into that. I won't name the critics that you need to follow, but there's only about 5 critics in the world that actually have a influence in the wine industry. Other ones are just people trying to make money off the wine industry and put stickers on the bottles and stuff like that, which is irrelevant to what we're trying to do. So scores are great. And I think if you're aiming for those 5 critics in the world. They're good enough to judge you for where you're coming from as opposed to the style they're looking for. So we do like to chase scores. It's always nice to get big scores. But it's also I'm taking Van der Constance into consideration, yes. Once you've created a track record and people know that your wine is always going to be a 96 to 98 point wine, the scores become less and less important, in my opinion. So I'm pretty sure that Chateau Chem and Romani Conti and all these guys don't send their wines into competitions anymore because it's irrelevant. You know that the wines are going to be fantastic. So you just need to get to that point, so then you can start free sailing from there. Obviously, if you make a bad wine, you're never going to come back from it. I mean, people are not stupid these days, especially when it comes to high-end quality wines. They know what's a good quality wine and what's a bad quality wine. So I think the other thing is the consumer reviews. The concepts of Vivino and all the rest is pretty cool. I mean, you've got your peers coming back or consumers coming back and real live people telling you what they think. And I think those are probably more important than what Mr. Big Score Giver out there gives you, I guess. I'm not naming any because the reviews.
It's a good point. And I think one thing, so at inventory, we do allow customers to leave reviews on wines, but we don't allow them to leave scores. And the reason for this is that the scores can be quite arbitrary, right? Sometimes you can gravitate towards a 91 or a 4.3 and it loses its meaning a little bit, whereas actually describing the experience, I think, is a lot more useful to other consumers and maybe even back to you. So I think the scores, the numbers are quite objective and wine is so subjective. So it can be a little tricky with the numbers.
Yeah, sure. The other problem with scores is they've all become inflated. So we almost need the 110 point scale. No wine is 100 point wine. And I don't believe that anyone should ever score 100 points because there's no such thing as perfection when it comes to winemaking. You can't get it. It's impossible. You can get a 99 points or a 98 point wine, but as soon as you got in that 100 point wine, it doesn't exist. It's a unicorn. People won't buy wine that's under 90 points. We get that quite often. And a 90 point wine is actually fantastic. An 88 point wine should be fantastic. It shouldn't be, you need to have 95, 96 points in order for you to be great. You always need to go to the 1 out of 10 score kind of scale as opposed to the 100 point scale, because it's a lot more, I don't know, just descriptive of what the wine actually is.
Yeah. And I think you're right that even the 100 point scale has sort of narrowed to maybe a 20 point scale, because I don't think I've ever seen anything under 80.
No, the 80 is undrinkable.
Yeah.
Did you see 80 was a pass? 80 wasn't a distinction, it was a very good pass.
Above average, for sure.
I know. I was a so damn it. I wouldn't have done well in wine schools.
No. So what's next for Klein Constantia? What's next for you? What's the next evolution? Because you've already moved so much in your last 10 years. What do the next 10 years hold?
World domination, probably. We're going to take over the world. No, my big goal is to focus on Anwilke. Anwilke is, it's such a fun project. There's so much potential there. So that's where we're going to do a big push. Van der Constance, we're aiming to get 100 points. Not joking. So Van der Constance has done very well in that it's now on the Bordeaux exchange. It's being sold with some fantastic peers in a great environment. The goal there is just to get it to that level of being, when people ask the question, what are the great sweet wines of the world, or what is the greatest sweet wine in the world? Most people are going to say Chateau de Chem, but a lot of people need to say, well, what about Van der Constance? And then we've reached our goal. Okay, so that's the goal for Van der Constance. And then the goal for Sauvignon Blanc is, I think we should become I want to become the new world Sauvignon Blanc king and guru. I think New Zealand's done it for a long time, and there's a big gap at the moment for a South African producer to put up their hands and actually do it properly.
I think that's a great goal. You just need a bit more hair if you're going to reflect Didier Dagenot. Let's shift to your personal cellar and your personal drinking. So what are a few great wines that you've had personally recently? Maybe name 3.
Quota is my favorite. Sakata. I love it. So I have that on every special occasion I possibly can. We've got a big cellar of that. What else have I had recently? A 1976 Nederburg Cabernet. And I've had a couple of those. I think it's one of South Africa's greatest Cabernets or greatest red wines ever made, and it's still drinking very well today. So that's a fantastic wine to look at. A wine that brought a tear to my eyes is the 1987 Riesling from Klein Constantia, not to name one of ours. And the last one I had recently, Angelus 2015, was very good. That's a very nice wine, actually. That's about it. I've been spoiled.
Yeah, you do have a beautiful cellar. I mean, I can attest to that, having seen it. The 2015, was that a touch young, or was it a great spot?
We had it with a very big fat steak off the fire, so it was perfect for that kind of situation. We do have older, but yeah, we have very few of those. So 15 is always a good show of wine.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Matt. This was a really great overview of Klein Constantia, great introduction. I hope for all of our collectors out there who are not yet buying Vin de Constance and equating you with Chateau d'Yquem as the new best sweet wine in the world, or your Sauvignon Blancs as the new Sancerre, then I hope they go out and find it, because it is fairly available for most people to add to their cellars, and I hope they all do.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. It's been good fun.
Absolutely. So to all of our listeners, make sure you click the little button below and subscribe, whether on YouTube or on any of our podcast platforms. You can find Klein Constantia. I think if you want to find it, you have a website. You also have a social handle, don't you? Are you on Instagram?
I am, but I don't know what my handle is. I'm sorry.
I would assume, well, the Klein Constantia is just
on any form of a social media, but Klein Constantia would have it. I'll say Klein Constantia or something like that.
Search Klein Constantia and it shall be found. Cool. And if you want to follow Inventory or get started managing your collection, download the app on the App Store, sign up at inventory.com, or follow us on Instagram at Inventory. And we will be back next week with another great episode. So thank you again, Matt. This was really fun.